Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. It's been a few weeks since Anbernic released a new handheld device, and you know what that means, they're going to release a new one. So this is the RG28XX. The 28 stands for 2.8 inches, which is the size of the screen. So this is really just a smaller version of other devices they've recently released, like the RG35XX Plus and H models. So same chipset and performance, just in a smaller form factor. And I would consider this to be just on the cusp of being a micro handheld. It is super pocketable and thin, and so if you're looking for something that's very, very portable to be able to play up to Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, then this might be a good choice for you. I wouldn't consider this to be a serious handheld, something you'd want to play for hours on end or to be your primary device, but it's a great little addition if you're just looking for something you can throw in your pocket and take it around town. And so in this video, we're going to do all my favorite stuff. We're going to test out the hardware and the size of it, but then also, how the buttons and ergonomics work, as well as the screen and the emulation performance. And overall, I think Anbernic made a lot of good moves with this one, including those color options. Those are pretty neat, but it's not perfect, and we'll talk about that as well. Anyway, without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, usually I start these videos talking about the price and where you can find them, but I'm a little bit early in making this video, and so as a result, I actually don't know when it's coming out or what the price is going to be. So as of at least making this video right now, yeah, it's not listed up on the Anbernic website or on AliExpress. However, we can get a pretty good idea of what it's going to cost if we compare it against other devices using the same chip from Anbernic. A good example will be the RG35XX. This one retails for somewhere around $60, but it's often on sale for around $50 or $55. And so I don't have any sort of inside baseball, but if I had to guess, I would say the RG28XX is going to be around $50 altogether. And I think the release is going to be very soon because they're already promoting it on their YouTube channel. And there's also going to be 4 different color versions. In addition to the beige, white, and orange ones that I have for testing, there is going to be a DMG gray as well as a black transparent model. So let's go ahead and move on and talk a little bit about the specs. Now this is using the Allwinner H700, same chip that we've seen in other devices. This is a quad-core A53 with a Mali GPU, and it also comes with 1GB of RAM. The display is just over 2.8 inches and has a 480p resolution. The battery is also fairly large, it's 3100 mAh, and in my testing I found to get about 4 or 5 hours on average. And it's also fairly lightweight, 124 grams is what I weighed it at, which is about 4.5 ounces. As far as connectivity, it has a mini HDMI port and a headphone jack, but notably it does not have Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. And it's also running on their stock operating system and comes with a mono speaker and 2 microSD card slots. Now all the specs are well and good, but you might be wondering what exactly you can even play on this device. And so here's a list of different consoles that you can play, and most of these will play perfectly fine. There's going to be a couple where you can't play the entire catalog, like PlayStation Portable, but for most of the others, you'll be able to play just about everything. Before we get to the unboxing, let me show you off the case that Anbernic sent over along with the review unit. And this is just one of those cheap hardshell cases, but tailor-made for the size and shape of the 28XX. And it has a little mesh pocket inside. You could put like a charging cable in there or maybe a couple chips, whatever you want. Anyway, let's move on to the unboxing, and this is a review unit, but as always, all opinions are my own and no money was exchanged in any way. Inside the box, you will find that there is a quick start guide just like with their other devices, and it mostly will just tell you what button does what. In addition, it will come with a USB-C to USB-A charging cable. Let's take a look at the device itself. We're going to test this with the orange model, and first impressions, man, this thing is very orange. In addition, it's also very rounded and comfortable feeling in the hand, but then also the texture of the plastic's pretty good. It's got a little bit of texture to it, it feels nice. My next impression was that, yeah, it feels very small. It's also relatively thin, about the same thickness as the RG35XX. I also really like horizontal handhelds like this. I just find them to be more comfortable, and so this thing is both small and pretty comfortable to hold as well. Now, I read most of the comments on my videos, and so I know there's a large population of people out there who are going to find this device way too small for their eyes or for their hands. And I totally get that, but then I also value something that's super pocketable. That means you'll have it on you more often, which means you'll be able to play it more. And I always find myself in situations where I could always just pull up my phone and play some social media, but if I have a handheld on me, I could play a retro game instead, and I'd rather do that most of the time. And so that's where I see a value in a smaller handheld like this. Yes, it's a compromise when it comes to controls and screen, but because it's portable, that means I'll spend more time actually using it, and I often will play these devices more than any of the other big ones. And thanks to the fact that it doesn't have analog sticks, it's going to slide in and out of your pocket no problem, which is pretty cool too. Anyway, let's move on and start talking about the controls. We're going to start with the D-pad. Now, the D-pad itself is relatively small, a lot smaller than most other Anbernic devices. In addition, the D-pad sticks out quite a bit from the shell, about the same as their other devices, but because the D-pad is so small, it just feels a little bit more prominent. And it does have a rubber membrane connection like with their other devices, so it has a classic and kind of retro feel to it. And one thing I noticed right off the bat, because it is kind of elevated but also small, it has a lot of pivot to it. So let's put it through a couple real-world tests. We're going to start with the contra test. In this example, I like to press down on the D-pad and then rock it back and forth. And the ideal thing here is that the character will move a little bit if I really push it to the edge, but in general, if I just wiggle it a little bit, the character will stay put. And that's exactly what's happening here. In fact, this is probably one of the best examples of this working correctly with an Anbernic device that I've ever tested. And some of this might be coming from the fact that the D-pad itself is just a little bit less wide and tall, but all the same, yeah, this is fully passing the contra test with flying colors. Now on the opposite end, I like to test it out with a Street Fighter game to see how easy it is to throw Hadouken and Shoryuken. And the important thing here is hitting the diagonal when you want to, and sure enough, yeah, this is working out really well too. If anything, I would say it was right on the cusp of where the diagonals are a little bit hard to press down on, but once I acclimated to the overall control scheme, no problem whatsoever. I did miss a couple inputs here and there, but most of that is a skill issue, not necessarily the D-pad. So yeah, I'm happy to say that on both the Contra and the Street Fighter tests, it's totally working. This is Hadoukenable and Shoryukenable. Another thing worth noting, because the D-pad is so small and elevated, it works really well when trying to use it as a substitute for an analog stick. For example, with Super Mario 64, I had no problem controlling the character exactly where I wanted him to be. In fact, this is probably the only time that I've been able to use a D-pad with Mario 64 and actually enjoy it. And so overall, I am surprisingly impressed by this D-pad. I thought that because it was so small, it would be underwhelming, but it's the exact opposite for me. If I had to compare the size and feel of the D-pad to another handheld device, it would actually be this Game & Watch that was released by Nintendo a couple years back. The D-pad on this one is almost identical in size, although it's a little bit slicker and glossier and also doesn't stick out as much. But you can see in a side-by-side, they are almost identical in terms of size. And so if you have access to one of these Game & Watch devices, you probably know how this is going to feel. And Anbernic will usually skew towards having Nintendo-like controls, and I think this is a perfect example. And the way I see it, if this D-pad is good enough for Nintendo, it's going to be good enough for Anbernic too. Now, also on the left side, we have our select and start buttons. These feel like they have a dome switch connection. They are a little bit clicky, but also very soft and quiet. Now let's move over to the right side and talk about these face buttons because they are quite small and one of my big disappointments with this device. Now these are almost identical to the D-pad in terms of feel. They are a little bit elevated from the shell, but then also have that rubber membrane connection, so a very classic feel overall. But if you compare them to a similar device like the RG28XX, you can see that they are quite a bit smaller. These are both glossy buttons, but between the two, I don't really like going any smaller than what we can find on the 35XXH if I can help it. And it does feel like there's probably room in the shell to make these bigger or at least a little bit more spaced out. The buttons themselves are 6.43 millimeters wide. That makes them bigger than some other Anbernic devices like the RG Nano, but I would almost consider this to be in a class of its own. This is more like a trinket than an actual gaming device. A closer comparison is the GKD Pixel. These are a little bit under 6 millimeters, so they're smaller, but they're also spaced out a little bit more. And so yes, at 6.43 millimeters, it does feel a little bit small. Now I'm not asking for the full 7.85 millimeters on the 35XXH, but maybe somewhere in between. For example, between these two are the Nintendo Switch Joy-Con buttons. These are 7.27 millimeters. Or even if it was just bumped up to a little over 7 millimeters like the TrimUI Smart, I think that would be a really great compromise. And admittedly, after playing with this device for the past couple days, I've gotten used to the size of the buttons, but I've never stopped wishing that they were a little bit bigger. Anyway, let's move on. Also on the right side is going to be a mono speaker. Let's do a quick audio test. Overall, I think the audio is okay. It's about the same as on the RG35XX Plus, and so they're probably using a very similar speaker between the two. Either way, it's not going to win any awards, but at least this sound is somewhat clear. Now let's look up top and check out these shoulder and trigger buttons. Now these are kind of interesting. On the shoulder buttons themselves, they're actually a little bit flush with the case, whereas the triggers are a little bit elevated. And I've never really seen a design like this from Anbernic in the fact that the shoulder buttons are so rounded and flush with the case. It makes it a lot more pocketable, so I do enjoy that. Now when it comes to actually using these buttons, they are not what I would call like your primary buttons. You can press them here and there, the shoulders and triggers when necessary, but it's not something I think you will probably enjoy. So if anything, I would try to use these for like hotkeys and things like that, but if you're going to be playing something that relies on these controls, it may not be very comfortable. The buttons themselves have a micro switch connection and are quite clicky. They're not super loud, but definitely audible, and more so than the other buttons on this device. And so overall, I would say, yeah, these buttons are not like a huge innovation and they are not super comfortable, but all the same, they will get the job done. However, one thing I also noticed is that these upper buttons are pretty loud when you shake the device. They kind of rattle. Let me give you a listen. Now let's compare it against the RG28XX. And so yeah, unfortunately this device is a little bit rattly. I don't think that's the end of the world. It's not a deal breaker for me, but all the same, it does make it feel a little bit on the cheap side. Either way, let's go ahead and look at I/O. We'll start with the left. This is our USB-C port. This can both charge the device and also hook it up to peripherals. And of note, when charging it, you will see a little orange LED indicator on the left, and when you turn the device on, it'll give you a green indicator on the right. And you can also turn these off in the settings. I'll show you how to do that later. Now near the center, you have their M button, which is like a menu or a function button. You'll use this for hotkeys as well as accessing the in-game menu. And then finally, we have our mini HDMI port. And I did test this as well, and yeah, it worked just fine. You can hot plug it, no problem. It'll connect to a TV or a monitor just like this. And when navigating through the menus, it's going to blow it up to 16:9, which looks really good on a modern display. However, another thing I noticed is that when actually playing a game, it stretched it out to full screen or 16:9, and because most of these games are going to be playing in 4:3, it is going to look a little bit stretched. Now, generally what you're supposed to be able to do is go into the RetroArch settings and then change out the scaling aspect ratio so that you can use something else. But with this device, it's not so simple because it's using a rotated display, and so as a result, all of the aspect ratios are actually backwards. And we'll talk about this more in detail later, but no matter what aspect ratio you choose, it's just going to get wider instead of taller. So really the only thing I could find to at least blow up the screen but then also shrink it to 4:3 is to make a custom aspect ratio. And I'm just kind of spitballing it right here, but if you adjust the width and make it a little bit smaller, then yes, you will be able to get something that's at least close to 4:3. And so using the stock operating system, it is possible to replicate these old school games in a more accurate way, but it will take a little bit of elbow grease. Next, let's take a look at the bottom. On the left, we have our headphone jack, and then we have our 2 microSD card slots. And the device is going to come with a 64GB card. They've actually upgraded these to Kioxa cards, which are Toshiba cards, so this is actually pretty high quality. And these cards are going to be preloaded with a bunch of games, which we will check out here later. On the right, we have our power and reset buttons. You might be worried about accidentally pressing them, but they are very flush with the device, but then also kind of hard to press down on, so I don't think you're going to press them accidentally at all. Same thing with the volume buttons. These are again flush with the device, so you have to be very deliberate when pushing the volume up and down. And really that's about it with my assessment of the hardware. I wish that the face buttons were a little bit bigger, and I do think it's a little bit uncomfortable to try to use the triggers and shoulder buttons, but overall I think it's a fairly comfortable device and much more comfortable than a vertical device for me. Next, I want to look at the other color option that they sent over. This is the beige white model, and you can see it has these light purple buttons, very similar to the Nintendo 3DS that was released in Japan. And overall, I like the look of this one as well. I'm not a huge fan of the off-white beige look right here, just because it looks a little bit aged and worn, but maybe you'll like that as well. For me personally, I think I like the orange one better. It just has a nice pop to it. It kind of reminds me of a creamsicle, so I think that's pretty cool. And so while I do appreciate that they're even trying out these new colors, the orange one is definitely the pick for me. It's a little bit loud, but I kind of like that as well. Okay, next I want to compare a bunch of different sizes, those that are similar when it comes to maybe the chipset or the screen size or just the overall size. We'll start with the RG35XX because I feel like the 28XX is kind of its little brother. These both have the same resolution screen, but obviously the 35XXH screen is going to be larger. And of course, as a result, the entire device is larger as well, including the size of the D-pad and face buttons and having 2 analog sticks. It's a similar story with the RG35XX Plus. This one is exactly the same, but with a vertical orientation and also no analog sticks. Between these three, it's really going to come down to what form factor you prefer and screen size, pocketability, all that kind of stuff. Now, the RG28XX is not the first Anbernic device with a 2.8-inch screen. In fact, there are 2 others. The first is the RG280M. This one came out a few years ago, and there's quite a few differences here. Number one, it has a much bigger bezel, but then also the chipset on this one is very weak. It can play most PS1 games, to give you an example. And the resolution on this one was always weird too. It's 320 by 480, with the 480 being half-height pixels. And that was kind of a nightmare when it came to scaling retro games, and so I never really found a good fit for this one. Now, one device that I used to use a lot is the RG280V, which is also very similar to the other one, but in a vertical form factor. In fact, when I brought it into the studio to do the size comparison, I realized that the battery was dead, and so unfortunately, I'm not able to show you the screen comparison between these two. Let's move up just a little bit more to the RG300X. This one has a 3-inch screen and the same resolution of 640 by 480. Now, there were a few sticking points about this device that didn't really set it apart for me. The first is that it's using that old chipset in those other devices we were just looking at, and so again, performance was pretty limited. In addition, this screen was a little bit on the dim side, and so even when playing it at full brightness, you couldn't play this in brightly lit environments. And then finally, the device itself is a fingerprint magnet, much like the Game Boy Micro that it's modeled after. So again, this is another Anbernic device that didn't receive a lot of love from me. Now, when it comes to smaller handhelds, there have been 2 in particular that I've been playing the most over the past few months. The first is the GKD Pixel. I made a couple of videos about it and talked about why I like it so much, and as you can see here, it is quite a bit smaller than the RG28XX. And truth be told, the GKD Pixel is not my favorite micro handheld. A lot of that has to do with the fact that it's vertical. I like horizontal handhelds, and so the TrimUI Smart is actually my favorite pick. And this one is very similar to the 28XX. It's about the same size, but as you can see, the screen is smaller and has a lower resolution. And I've made a couple videos about this one too, talking about why I like it so much, but my major complaint about it has always been that the screen has felt just a little bit too small. And in a side-by-side comparison, for all intents and purposes, the RG28XX solves that problem for me. When it comes to a micro or smaller handheld, I found that between 2.8 and 3 inches with a 4x3 display is the perfect size for me. Even though it's only a 0.4 difference in size, you can see here it's kind of night and day between the two. I would much rather play on the larger screen on the 28XX over the TrimUI Smart. And the screen experience for me is very important. It's probably second only to controls and ergonomics. And I think between the two, yeah, the Anbernic wins. Now, it's not 100% clear-cut because I would rather have the buttons on the TrimUI Smart on the Anbernic device, and so if anything, I would swap them if I could. And of course, bear in mind that even though the 2.8-inch screen on this is better, it's not perfect. For example, it's kind of dwarfed by a 3.5-inch screen like on the RG35XXH. So really, by doing all these comparisons, my point here is that there's no perfect device, there's no perfect screen. It's all going to come down to context and what situation fits you the best. The RG35XX is a wonderful handheld. I've been enjoying it so much, I've been using it all the time. That being said, if it was a little bit smaller, I bet I would use it more. And that's really the sweet spot with the RG28XX in that it is smaller. And so if you are looking for something more portable and don't mind having a smaller screen and smaller controls, then yeah, this is going to be a great fit. And so even though we're not at the end of the video just yet, I'm going to give you a quick spoiler, and that is when it comes to small horizontal handhelds, the RG28XX has become my new favorite. And some of it has to do with the screen size, but a bigger component has to do with the software and the performance, so let's move into that. Now, the device is going to ship with the stock Anbernic operating system, which is what we're going to use in this review. It's a pretty simple setup, and it's very similar to what you will find on the other XX devices. Let me give you a quick walkthrough, starting with the far left. This section is called Game Rooms. Within here, you will find these standalone emulators, and for the most part, I've always recommended to not use these unless it's the PSP standalone. But unfortunately, for some reason, they've removed the PSP standalone from the options here, and so I don't think that there's any reason to use the standalone emulators on this device, at least right now. My guess is they couldn't figure out how to deal with this screen rotation, and so they just yanked it instead. Either way, it's not a big deal because in the next section they have what they call RA Game. This is going to be all the RetroArch cores that you can launch. It'll be organized by various systems and it's pretty easy to navigate through. You will just find your game and then launch it. And the SD card that comes with the device will be loaded up with a bunch of games, and they are pretty complete collections when it comes to these ROM sets. However, of note, there are no Mario games. They basically removed any game that has the word Mario in it, so you'll have to add those yourself. Same thing with Nintendo 64 for some reason. They just took those out as well. So bear in mind, you'll have to add some of your own ROMs, but it's a pretty easy process. You just throw it in a computer and then dump them onto the SD card. Anyway, once you've found a game that you want to launch, just press the A button and it'll start right up. And then once you're done and you want to exit the game, you'll press on that menu button on the top and then start at the same time. That's going to close out of the game and bring you back to the main menu. And all the hotkeys are explained in that little quick guide that comes with the device. But another handy one is pressing the menu button and R2 at the same time. That's going to toggle on and off the fast forward function. It's a little bit awkward to reach up and press those buttons, but I got used to it after a couple days. Additionally, while in a game, if you just tap on the M button, it's going to bring up the RetroArch quick menu so you can make adjustments within here. For example, if you want to save and load a state, this is where you would do it. Next on the list is the favorites menu. So what you can do is just navigate through the games list and then press the start button. It's going to add it to the favorites and you will find it there. And if you want to remove it, you can just press the start button and it'll disappear. After that, we have the history section, which will give you a list of your most recently played games, and then after that, you will find the search function. And this is handy because there are thousands of games on this device, so you can just go and type in the word Kirby, it'll bring up all the Kirby games, you can pick them from there, and that's probably going to be a little bit faster. Now to the right of that, they have what they're calling the App Center, and as far as I know, this is now a new section within their software. This comes with a music player, a video player, an ebook reader, as well as a file manager, and then also something called Expert. I'm not really sure what this does. Now, I messed around with this for a while with the white model, and I found that the file types are actually really inclusive. So for example, with the music player, you can use FLAC files, and MP3 and M4A, and so there's a lot of options here. And this is one of those things I like about these smaller handhelds is that they can double for something like an MP3 player. You can even set it to turn off the screen after a minute or two. That way you can turn off the screen, save battery, but still listen to music if you'd like. And I do like the fact that this has a headphone jack. The upcoming Miu A30, which is their horizontal version of the Miu Mini, that one does not. You'll have to use a USB-C adapter. To exit out of the music player, you just tap on the menu button, then select close the app, and then confirm. Now I also tested out the video player, and like with the music player, it accepts a wide range of different file types. The two that I really tested with are different MP4 files as well as MKV files, and these work great. In fact, it also supports multi-track video files as well as subtitle files. However, of note, because the screen is rotated, it's going to show the subtitles on the left side as opposed to on the bottom. So that is a little bit weird. And this is going to be great if you want to load up an old TV show like Dragon Ball. These all played in a 4:3 aspect ratio, so they're going to be a perfect match for this device. Anyway, same thing here, just tap on the menu button and then close out of the app and you are good to go. Okay, and then finally on the far right we have our settings cog. Within here we've got a bunch of different options. Here you can choose when the screen is going to time out and go to black, but then you can also adjust the brightness too. We've got 5 different settings here within the stock operating system, and to be honest, the range that we have is not super wide. For example, on the very lowest brightness, it's still relatively bright. I would not call it super dim. And on the opposite side, at the very brightest level, I would not call it super bright either. And I would say the screen itself is not super high quality. The viewing angles are relatively poor, and the overall brightness just doesn't get very bright. Even here at the very brightest setting, I still found it to be relatively dim. And here's a look at me playing it outdoors. Now, this is not in direct sunlight, but under a cover or shade, and so it would get even worse if you had it in direct sunlight. But if you're in shade, maybe like in a car, this will definitely work, but it's just not super impressive. Here's the comparison with the RG28XX, and both of these are at max brightness. And yeah, you can see that there is definitely a huge difference between the two, not only when it comes to viewing angles, but just overall brightness. Again, I wouldn't say it's the end of the world, but it will limit your gameplay in certain situations. And beyond that, in the settings, there's not a lot to talk about. You can change out the language and then also jump directly into RetroArch, and you can make some quick adjustments like the background image and the button icons. One thing of note, this is not the only place where you can make adjustments. If you go back into the RA Games section and scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll find an app section. And within here are a bunch of standalone scripts that might be of interest to you. For example, there's a night mode, which will turn on a certain dimming within RetroArch. I don't think it looks very good, but you can try that out if you'd like. In addition, this is where you would turn off the power LED if you don't want to see it. Anyway, that's about it when it comes to the stock operating system, but one of the main draws of this device is the fact that there is custom firmware available with other devices that use the same chipset. In fact, the team that's been working on the Batocera builds for the RG28XX devices has now started their own distribution. They're calling it Cannuli or Newly, I'm not really sure how to pronounce this word. Either way, this is a fork of Batocera, and it's named after a bug, much like how Batocera is. Now, this is still in very early alpha access, so it doesn't have any public release just yet, but I think it's going to be coming here very soon. And already it is working great on both RG35XX Plus and the RG35XXH. It's also based on Batocera 40, but has a 64-bit architecture. In addition, they're making some big improvements, including adding port masters, so that's going to be a really awesome upgrade for all these devices. Now, unfortunately, I tried out my Cannuli and Batocera cards, and neither of them worked. I think it has to do with the bootloader and the screen itself because it's so different from the others, and so this is something the development team will probably have to iron out over time. Of note, the Anbernic card is not interchangeable with the 35XX devices either, and so there's definitely something going on with the screen, and so this is just going to take a little bit more time. At the very least, I'm happy to report that the Anbernic stock firmware is mostly functional. There are a couple hiccups here and there, which we'll go over here in a minute, but for the most part, you'll be able to get in and out of your games pretty easily, you'll be able to adjust things in RetroArch, and the performance here is pretty great. So let's jump into our testing and talk about that experience. And of note, because this screen is rotated, the FPS icon is going to be on the bottom instead of on the top. Not only that, the font is super tiny, so it'll be hard to read if you're trying to follow along. Either way, I'll make notes about the performance as we go, and really when it comes to things like Game Boy and Game Boy Color, no problem here whatsoever. And because we're using RetroArch, we're going to have a wide variety of options. For example, with Game Boy, we can change out the colorization on the fly by pressing the shoulder buttons. And then we can also make other adjustments. For example, with Game Boy Color, I've turned on color correction to give it a little bit more muted color profile, but then also I added a shader which gives it an LCD grid overlay. And after making those little tweaks, I think the games look awesome. Now, Game Boy Advance does take a little bit more work, and that's because by default, it's going to run at full screen or 4:3. But this is a 3:2 system, so you may want to adjust it. Let me show you what I had to do. First of all, I went into the RetroArch quick menu and then backed out into settings and then video and then scaling. And here I had to set up a custom aspect ratio because the screen is rotated and causes all sorts of issues. Now the text here is small and my camera wasn't able to pick up on it, but these are the parameters on the top left. And so what I did here is I took 640 and I multiplied it by 2/3, which is going to give us a 3:2 aspect ratio. Now the exact number is 426 2/3, and so I rounded it up to 427. That'll give us the closest to 3:2 that I could get, and then I also adjusted the X position down to the center, which is going to be about 30 pixels. And unfortunately, these are the kind of tweaks you'll have to do if you want to make it very accurate, at least in the stock firmware. And that's because if you try out any of the other aspect ratios, they're going to be all wonky because the screen is rotated. So with any luck, by the time the custom firmwares are available, they will take care of a lot of this stuff for you, but at least right now, you may have to do it manually if you are an early adopter of this device. And the same will go with other systems. For example, Neo Geo Pocket Color also is adjusted to a 4:3 aspect ratio when the actual aspect ratio was a little bit more squarish. So these are the kind of hiccups you'll have to deal with if you do stick with the stock operating system. Now, thankfully, most of these systems that you'll be playing on here run at a 4:3 aspect ratio, so it'll be a moot point. And as expected, all of those home console systems, things like Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Genesis, and its accessories, all these are going to play just fine. The chipset on here is way more powerful than what these emulators demand, and so it's going to run these no problem. And same thing with arcade games, all your 80s and 90s classics are going to play here no problem, everything up to Killer Instinct. And by default, when you play a vertical game, it's going to rotate the controls and the screen for you. It's a little bit awkward to play this way, but it does fill up the whole screen, which looks really nice. I would say after a few minutes of getting used to this, I had no problem playing it like this. On a similar note, PlayStation 1 games play absolutely fine. In fact, I played all these games at a 2x or high resolution setting, and absolutely no problem with these. Even the harder to run games like Tekken 3, no problem. So if you are looking to play PlayStation 1 with an upscaled resolution and no compromises, then I think that this is going to be a good fit. Now I have to be honest, the systems that I had the most fun testing were not any of these. It was actually Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, so let's talk about this experience. And I'm not really sure what drew me to this in the first place. I think it really has to do with the fact that this is the first small device that's really capable of playing most of these games. When I think of these small devices, I always think about, oh yeah, it can play up to PS1, yeah, we'll be able to play our classics on here. But I never really think about the fact that you could also play Dreamcast and Nintendo 64 too. And on the Anbernic stock software, they did a pretty good job remapping the controls, so that way the analog stick controls are controlled by the D-pad. And so after loading up my Nintendo 64 games, I didn't really have to configure a lot in terms of controls. You also got a little bit of choice when it comes to the different emulators as well as the graphic plugins. When you're in the Nintendo 64 menu, you can press the Y button and then change out between the parallel and the Mupen 64 cores. By default, it's going to be the parallel core, which I found to be more performant, so I've mostly stuck to that. Additionally, while you're in a game, if you press the menu button, you can bring up the quick menu and then go into the options. Within there, you'll find a graphics plugin setting, and you have multiple options here. By default, it's going to be the Rice plugin, which usually gives you the best performance, but can give you some graphical glitches. And I found the next performant plugin is the one that's called GLN64, or Glide N64. So if you are getting graphical issues, I would recommend changing to that one. After that, go back to the options menu and then scroll to the top. You'll see a setting that says Manage Core Options. Click on that, and then select Save Game Options. That's going to save that graphical plugin specifically for that game. Then when you close out of the game and then bring it back up, it's going to be running with that plugin instead. And depending on the game, it might improve the visuals. Now with Ocarina of Time, it isn't quite there. I found that the ground has some weird artifacts to it, but it does improve some of the shadow issues that I was having with the Rice plugin. Now, one cautionary note with Nintendo 64 is because we don't have analog sticks, that does mean you'll be limited in the amount of inputs that you can use. For example, with some games, you'll need to press the C buttons, especially with Ocarina of Time. And because they're not mapped, you might get stuck in the game where you can't actually follow through. And there are workarounds for this, like mapping multiple buttons and things like that, but it will get pretty complicated over time. Another example would be Star Fox 64. This one plays great, but you're limited with those controls. The break button is pressing down on the C button, and unfortunately that isn't mapped. And so you will lose some functionality depending on the game, so you kind of have to be choosy about which games are going to be the best fit. But there are plenty of games that are going to run great, including F-Zero and Mario 64, Mario Kart 64, as well as Paper Mario. So even though you will be limited with some games, and I would rather have those analog sticks for controls, I still think there are plenty of games in this catalog that'll be fully playable. And having a 480p resolution on a 2.8-inch screen makes everything look super crisp and clear. And I found it to be exactly the same when it came to Sega Dreamcast. It was really a revelation to be able to play these games on such a small device. And so I could definitely see myself playing through a couple Dreamcast RPGs like Skies of Arcadia or Grandia 2. All those are going to play great. There were also a ton of great racing and fighting games on the Dreamcast, and all of these are a lot of fun to play as well. Now by default, any Dreamcast game that lets you use the D-pad is going to work right out of the box, but if it requires an analog stick, you'll have to remap it yourself. And this is pretty easy. You'll just want to go into the quick menu, then go into controls, and then pick port 1 controls. Next, under the D-pad inputs, which are labeled as hat number 0, you'll want to change these to the analog inputs. That means that the D-pad is going to behave like an analog stick. And I've already made those adjustments, but after you've done that, then exit back into the main control section, and then go to Manage Remap Files. Within there, it'll say Save Game Remap, and you'll be good to go. I've already done it with this game, so that's why you're not seeing it, but that's how you would set it up. Anyway, yeah, that's how you play Sega Dreamcast. Now, not all of these games are going to play at 100% speed. Many of them will use frame skip, but I found that most games that I tried played perfectly fine. And finally, the last system I wanted to show off is PlayStation Portable. This one also by default is going to be 4x3, but you can change that back to 16x9. And to be honest, I didn't really find PSP to be a very playable experience. You will find games that'll play at full speed at a 1x resolution, but they're going to be pretty few and far between. Virtua Tennis World Tour is a good example. This game plays really well. However, the screen is so small that it is very hard to even see the ball while you're playing, and so I wouldn't really recommend it from a visual standpoint either. And of course, as you start to play some of those harder to play games, those that have like 3D graphics, it's going to get really hard to play. You could always turn on a frame skip, but that's going to make the gameplay feel pretty jittery, and even then, it's not going to solve your issues with every game. So in general, I definitely would not buy this device expecting to play PSP, but you might find a couple surprises here and there. Okay, that's really it when it comes to game testing, so let's start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the Anbernic RG28XX. As always, we're going to start with what I like, and first and foremost is the fact that it is super portable. I love the fact that I can just throw this in my pocket. It's definitely on the cusp of being a micro handheld. I also like the look of 480p content on a 2.8-inch screen. I think it looks really crispy. I had some reservations about the D-pad before I tried it, but once I tried it, I immediately enjoyed it, and so I think this is a good D-pad, even if it is a little bit small. I also like the fact that Anbernic has 4 different color choices with this model. Often they will only have maybe 2 or 3, and they're usually always very similar. I like the fact that they went out on a limb, and I really like that orange one too. And because we're using a chip that is being actively developed for, we have a couple different software options. The stock operating system has gotten a lot of updates and is pretty decent, so if you just use the card that comes with the device, you'll have a great time. But then also, there are a lot of custom operating systems that are being actively developed, and so we should see some other options down the line as well. And then finally, this one's really personal, but I really enjoyed playing Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast on such a tiny device. This is the first mini handheld that can reliably play most Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast games, and I think that shouldn't be overlooked. As it stands, this is easily the most powerful small handheld that we have available right now. But of course, it's not perfect, so let's talk about what I don't like. The first is that it feels rather cheap. And most of that has to do with the fact that the shoulder and trigger buttons kind of rattle, so every time you pull it out of your pocket, it just is a little reminder of the fact that this is a very cheap device. It's definitely not the end of the world, and it is what it is. After all, it is a cheap device, but all the same, it was something that bothered me over time. I also am not a huge fan of these small face buttons. I feel like there is room in the shell to make them just a little bit bigger or at least more spaced out. It took me a while to adjust to just using the very tip of my thumb to actually play with, but I wish it was just a little bit more comfortable. I also miss the fact that it doesn't have Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. I don't think it's 100% essential with a smaller handheld, but it would have been cool to be able to tether this to my smartphone and then be able to earn retro achievements while on the go. And then finally, there were some aspects to the screen that were disappointing, like the fact that it's dim and the viewing angles aren't great, but then also it's a rotated panel. That might cause issues for the custom operating system developers down the line. And so this is definitely kind of a mixed feeling screen in that I love the fact that it's 480p and crispy, but then also it has some shortcomings as well. In the end, I'm actually very positive on the RG28XX. I've only had it for a couple days and it's already shot up to my very favorite small handheld right now. There are many things about this device that are just right when it comes to a smaller handheld. I think the 2.8-inch screen is really nice, and I can't say enough good things about this D-pad. They really nailed it. Additionally, I found genuine joy in being able to play Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast games on such a small little device. It really is a marvel to hold. Now, when it comes to whether or not I recommend this for you, it's really going to be a personal decision and how you feel about smaller handhelds. If you think the screen is going to be too small or the controls are too cramped, then this might not be a good fit. However, if you like the idea of having something very portable and pocketable, then it might be worth taking that chance. And for my part, I really do like these smaller handhelds. I find that I play them more than any others because I happen to have them on me more often. And so if you can see yourself being in that kind of situation where you don't mind carrying this around and you might have a spare moment or two, then this might be a great fit. And don't get me wrong, the device is full of all these little compromises. The buttons are small, the device itself feels a little bit cheap and rattly, and then also the controls aren't a very good match for the original controller inputs for Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast. So it's definitely not a perfect experience, but if you can overlook these shortcomings, then I think there's a lot of fun to be had with the RG28XX. Now the big question is whether or not it's going to be dethroned by the upcoming handheld from Miu, which is going to have a horizontal form factor and a very similar size. But that's a question for another day when I actually have that device in hand. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you going to pick up this device, or do you think it's just a little bit too small? Or are you reserving judgment till we hear more about the Miu A30? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.